starting. Could you get a charger for me for this just in case? It's at 78, but
We're on?
Yeah.
Start.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning, Dilip and Joy.
good morning, Ajay.
Very happy to have Dilip and Joyma here to talk to us. A few months back, when Dilip wrote to me about that book that Joy and he have written, I was amazed because I had not heard of this incident in the history of India. And I thought this was a very important thing for all of us to know. So we took on Dilip and Joyma to come and have us spend a morning with us, telling us about what all that happened, what they discovered, and what it means. What does it tell us about ourselves? So uh, I'm so happy. Dilip is coming for the second time to Manthan. 10 years back, he had come and spoken to us about an earlier book that he had. And particularly happy to have Joyma with us. Joy is sitting in California on a late evening and participating here. Thank you, Joy, for doing this. I am sure all of us are going to learn a lot and understand from you what happened in the history of the country at that point of time. Over to both of you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Hi, Joy. Thank you, Ajay, very much. I do remember that previous time I came to Manthan with a lot of fondness. I even have a photograph somewhere of me speaking to you people at that place in Hyderabad. I'm forgetting the name right now. Forgive me, but so I'm so grateful that you've asked us to come and speak about this issue and our book. For anybody who's watching, you'll see the book behind Joy, behind her left shoulder, and there it is also. It's called the Deoliwallahs, which Joy and I have written. I want to just introduce this, maybe introduce Joy by saying that Joy was born in a prison camp. And how many of us can say that? It was a prison camp in a place called Deoli in Rajasthan, and that's why we have the name of the book is Deoliwallahs. One of the unknown consequences of our 1962 war with China was that 3,000 people of Chinese descent, but Indians of Chinese descent, let's call them Chinese Indians, were sent to this camp in Deoli in Rajasthan and kept there for a number of years, and for no reason except that they looked Chinese. They looked the way they did. And one of those people, one of those 3,000 people was Joy's pregnant mother, Effa. And Joy was therefore born in the camp. Joy spent her first 4 years in that camp. And her family was actually among the last who were actually released from the camp in 1967. So that's a good 4 years after they were put in there and 5 years after the war was ended. And I just want to qualify that by saying that most of these people who went to the camp actually went there after the war was over. So, in effect, most of the people who were in this prison camp were there after the war was over and for 5 years later. So we will learn a little bit more as we go on in this hour or hour and a half that we have. It was a privilege really to write this book with Joy, but I always wondered, and that's how I want to start this. I always wondered all through uh, how does an experience like that, how does an experience of being born in a camp and spending your first 4 years shape your life, shape your view of the world? So, therefore, Joy, I'd like to just start by asking you, when did you first fully understand, first fully comprehend that you were born in this camp and what it meant to have spent your first 4 years there, and how did you react when you first understood this?
Right. Thanks, Dilip, and thanks, Ajay, for inviting us. Uh, gosh, I guess I always knew it, right? I don't remember the early years when I landed in Calcutta. but I do remember my mom was always there. And my mom was always telling me stories, right? And so she would tell me stories about her life before the camp. Then she would talk about the camp. And she would say things like she and my dad would say, "Oh, you were born in the camp. It was on such and such day, and your brothers did this and did that." And so it didn't really it didn't really strike me as being any different, except that it was a very unique experience. When you're a little child, you really don't understand what it does to you. But one of the first things that happened was we kind of intrinsically knew that you did not talk about this outside of the house because for many reasons, right? We were a minority in Calcutta. There was a very strong anti-Chinese sentiment at that time, and there was a stigma that was carried with us. So when my mother went to Calcutta for a long time, she did not socialize because that's people would see us and be afraid to be associated with us. And so it took several years before people were less afraid of it. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that feeling of fear. Um, Even the people who were not taken to the internment camp, they were very afraid. They were dreading that their turn would come up because there was being no rhyme or reason of when people were taken, who was taken, and so anybody and all people were suspect. Um, when I grew up, there came this idea that I had to write a book about this to sort of chronicle this experience. And from my mother's point of view, she always felt that, oh, you should write it, you should write it. But I didn't know exactly how to write it. And I think that's a huge part of what the camp does to you, because you shut you shut off talking to other people outside your community and your circles about it. So the immediate circle is your family. The next circle is the people who are in the camp. And then after that would be the Chinese Indian community. And so if you are not able to talk outside those circles, it's kind of even more difficult to start a book or tell other people. And the other thing was, whenever we told anybody, if people knew about it, they just sort of, they moved on. And the people who did not know just were shocked, and they often did not know how to respond, and they would just shut up and shut down. And so it was pretty difficult. And at that time, I think in my teenage years, that's when I figured that, things were really quite different for someone who was interned and for me being born in the camp.
Joy, I just want to pick up on that one word you used, and you've used it a lot, I know, when we've talked before, this notion of stigma. Why should somebody like you have felt that stigma? Why should people who've come out of that camp feel that stigma?
For a long time, I didn't really understand it. I just felt that it was verboten, and it felt a terrible thing. But when I started talking more to the people outside my family, and I think my family sheltered me from certain things, or they assumed that I might know. But when I started talking to the people I wrote chapters on in the book, what came through is that shame they felt, that they felt they were considered criminals, and a big question that came out was, what have I done wrong? Why am I being locked up? So everybody felt horrible. They were picked up, paraded, in the eyes of a teenager, paraded down the street, past all their neighbors who knew them, but had come out of curiosity, out of just wanting to know what's happening. And all eyes were on them as they were led, followed by armed um, guards and police members into these trucks, these military trucks, and driven away. And so a lot of the people I spoke to for their chapters were teenagers at that time, and it hit them very hard. They were children, and there was a lot of not knowing, what was going on, and that, I think, exacerbated the sense of fear and shame, and that they were locked up for doing something wrong, but they didn't know what it was. They had a vague idea that it could just have been for who they were.
Yeah, I mean, that's the pity, isn't it? That there was, in no sense were you criminals, but yet somehow you started to feel that you were. That's I always feel that's one of the big, the great tragedies of this whole situation. The whole set of you were made to feel the shame for no reason at all. So,
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, that was, when I look at it, from a distance, it was a very dehumanizing experience for people because uh, at one point, they have lives, they have jobs, and then suddenly they're nothing. They're just like criminals. Some were not able to take anything. They with just literally one little bag and the shirt on their backs, and it was winter, and so it was really cold in
yeah.
Deoli, and so just things like that. Yeah.
Um, okay, let me just go on from there before allowing you to jump in on this. But
Oh, okay.
related to
I'll go
that,
next.
huh?
Sorry,
What's that?
I'll ask my question next.
Okay. No.
Sorry to interfere,
Yeah.
but would both of you be a little louder?
Okay. All
Okay,
right.
hold
Sorry.
on.
Yeah,
Can I? Maybe I can hold my mic here. Is that
you
Okay,
are fine there.
okay?
Dilip, this
okay.
is good. Yeah.
All right. So Joy, as you grew up in this country, I know you went to school in Calcutta and then you went to college in Delhi and so on at LSR. Did you ever find yourself? This is sort of related to what I asked earlier, but did you ever find yourself wishing that your friends knew about what had happened to you? I mean, that they weren't so ignorant. I mean, in other words, what I'm really asking is, did the ignorance about this incarceration, this widespread ignorance, did it disturb you in any way?
I think as a child, I was more glad that I wasn't singled out. Already, I was different, right? And anything that did not single me out was actually a good thing. And so if they didn't know about it, I was all right with it, in elementary school. But then that carried on to college, where you make deeper friendships, and so that was a little bit, quite a little bit isolating, not terribly isolating, because I think we'd all sort of trained ourselves to live like like an inside life and an outside life, um, but without not without. So I don't want to say that. What do I mean? Like, we knew who we were, we knew what our identity was, and if anybody knew about it, that's fine. But we were not about to volunteer that information.
Uh,
So yeah, it was a bit complicated, when you're growing up, when you're young, you don't want to be different. You really don't want. But already I was very different. But the kids are kind, the girls are fine, and so I wanted to keep it that way. Yeah.
and when you say you're different, it's because of the way you look. That's the way you
The way
felt.
I looked, yeah. I was the only Chinese girl in my class of like 30 and 40 girls. Maybe there was one other, like maybe two other, all through. And we might have been the only Chinese girls in that tiny little convent school. Um, anyway, I did want to have a question.
Joy,
I have
one
questions.
sec.
Yeah,
I'll just
right.
let me tell you. My wife just came in and gave me this quiet note that says that your voice drops towards the end of your sentences. So, and
Okay.
she's underlined that I need to be louder too. So maybe we should
Oh,
just be aware of that. Okay, carry on.
okay. We'll do this. So I did have questions for you, and my first question is, um, tell our viewers how you learned about the internment, and then what led you to writing this book. Um,
Well, like everybody else, as Ajay mentioned earlier, and you've been alluding to, I had no idea this happened. I mean, it was not even in my consciousness. I don't even know how I didn't know. But about 7 or 8 years ago, a friend of mine who is of Chinese descent, who comes to visit us regularly, comes and stays with my mother and comes over for dinner. So she came over for dinner and she was chatting about everything as usual. And out of the blue, she just said, this particular little episode happened in 1962, where India sent a number of people to a concentration camp. That is the word she used. And she said, she actually asked me, did you know about it? And I thought, this was some kind of elaborate joke. She didn't look like she was joking, but I couldn't believe that this had actually happened. And then she went on to explain and said that, people like me were sent to this camp, people who look like me, people who look like you, Joy. And that's it. Just uh, I was just stunned for various reasons because, for one, that I didn't know it, and that it had happened at all. That India did this. I mean, I thought this concentration camps I'd grown up thinking of only that only happened in Germany during World War II. So to think that we had a camp like that, that was really it kind of hit me somewhere deep. So I just that was when I first heard about it, and I was so baffled by my ignorance that I have to start learning a little bit more about this. And through her and through some other contacts, I met a few people, started talking to them, and then I proposed an article. That was really what I pitched an article to a magazine called Caravan to write about this, and it happened to be the 50th year since the war, so it fit nicely. And I know that you also wrote for Outlook at that in that year, and so that's what uh, that pitching of the article made me articulate what I wanted to write about, and then I uh, went and did some research. I went to travel to the Northeast, and I traveled to Deoli to try to meet people to talk about this, and that's where it all started. So that article when it got published in November that year, it got circulated among the Chinese Indian community in Toronto and here. And so I got a few people who were writing to me and talking to me about it. And then eventually I, uh, I, sorry, just a sec. Eventually uh, I know that four of you decided to come in 2015 to talk about your stories in Delhi, and I came and joined you there, and that's when I got to know all of you, and it in some ways the story hit home even more because here were actual people who were in the camp. Until then, it was sort of academic in some way, if you get what I mean. But here were four people who were in the camp and were actually telling their stories, and it was very, very real for me. And I really started thinking there was a book here, and it had to be written, and the story had to come out. And then 2 years ago, no, 3 years ago in 2017, I was in California, and I spoke to Joy, and Joy said that she was trying to write this book based on oral histories of people in the camp. And I jumped on that and said, we should perhaps do this book together. And Joy was very interested, and that's how the book came about. Took us a year and a half, as we were saying, to write it. So there you are. That's my story, and in some ways I'm very, very glad that I did it. But it's also been a sad and in some ways revealing opening of my eyes to the kind of to this story. Yeah.
No, I'm really glad you were my co-author, and in doing the book, I learned every day. So even for somebody who's been, living under the shadow of the camp, it's there's
Lost
still
you,
many
Joy.
things. Yeah, I know. Sorry. Oh, okay. All right. Let me start.
Have
Hello.
we lost Joy?
No, she's fine.
Joy, we can't. I can't
Okay.
hear you, Joy.
We can hear
Oh,
you.
okay.
You can't hear.
How's this? So basically what I was saying is, even for somebody who has been living, and I know so much about the camp, I even learned a lot during my research and talking to people, making connections, because my mother tells me a lot of things, and then I have to go out and research it before I actually write the book. So I do understand. I did want that perspective of somebody who did not know much about Deoli, because most of the people I meet and most of the people Dilip meets do not know about it. So instead of only having the perspective of somebody who's been, living and breathing it for a while, I thought what would really be helpful for the book is to have an outside, like a new perspective, like as of a person who hasn't, who didn't know the subject.
Yeah. Um, and I mean, I think we should also mention here that one of the reasons that you came to Delhi was that's when I first came to know about all of you. Also, I mean, the actual people in the prison were was Rafiq Elias's film, Beyond Barbed Wire, which our viewers can see on YouTube if you look it up, which interviews Joy and interviews Yin Marsh and a few others and talks about what it was like to be in that camp, but also what it's been like in the years after. And that's also what brought us together, because Rafiq was also in that at those meetings in Delhi with me. So I just wanted to mention that. Yeah.
Yes, Rafiq was very, very important in the beginning to set us up and make the connections because his first movie, actually, his first film is actually The Legend of Fat Mama. And that was the first time anybody had taken the time to talk about the internment of the Chinese. And so, yes, we're very grateful, and he's a good friend. I wanted to take the opportunity to ask my next question of you, Dilip, and it is to do with the writing of the book. So, what was the most memorable thing you learned when you were writing the book? What came out for you as something
Something.
important?
Well, almost every day, Joy, there was something. But and the word memorable is not the word that comes to mind when but because memorable tends to have maybe pleasant
Pleasant.
connotations. But you know what I mean. I think in some ways, perhaps if I had to pick one thing, it was perhaps the most eye-opening thing for me was when you sent me Yiva Cheng's story. So let me tell whoever's watching, Yiva is the daughter of one of the people who was in the camp, whose story Joy also tells in the book. Michael Cheng, who was a teenager when he went to the camp, a little younger actually. He was maybe 10 years old or something. And then he grew up and emigrated to the States later. That's a story in itself. And Yiva, his daughter, was born and grew up in the States. But one of the stories in the book is her story. And, it's not, she was not in the camp. She was never lived in India. So what is her story doing in the camp? And yet to me, it was the most wrenching in some ways of the story, is because it gives you an idea of how this, whether you want to call it stigma or the whole story of this camp, has filtered down to the next generation. In a lot of ways, it was reminiscent to me of the little bit I've read about what happened in Nazi Germany, because it took a generation or two or three for people to come to terms with what their parents and grandparents had done. And in this case, for somebody like Eva to come to terms, or she's still struggling to come to terms with what had happened to her father in the camp, and the effect it has had on him over the years, and the effect it's had on their family. And so for me to try to understand that was in a lot of ways, it made, so for, at one level, it was important for me to meet Joy and Yin and so on, but it was also important for me to understand what had happened to this next generation. And I'd like to, if I could, just read a few lines from what Yiva writes, which captures for me what she's talking about, what I'm trying to tell you about. She talks about growing up in this small town in North Carolina in the US, and going to school and doing projects in school that had some that she would draw on her father's experience and so on. And then she talked to people who'd ask her, where are you from? And she tried to answer that question. It was always a difficult question. But then she says, and this is where I'm reading, she says, if I mentioned the camp, I would see people's eyes kind of glaze over and know that they couldn't handle it. So they just moved on. It's like having to say to someone I've just met, hey, so by the way, my dad was in an internment camp. It gets exhausting. Some people would try to be engaged and say, oh, that's so interesting. And I remember one woman who said, that's so exotic. I remember feeling so upset when she said that. This is not something that's exotic or an interesting detail. This is something that changed my father's life. It changed my family's life in so many ways. It continues to change my life. And that's what I actually, when I read this, I actually suggested to Joy that we should call this chapter, "Hey, my dad was in an internment camp," because I feel like that captures what it is, what it meant to Yiva. What does it mean to go around saying that my father was in a prison camp? It is something that I'd never thought of. I'd barely thought of what it meant to be born in that camp and grow up your first 4 years. But then I had never even thought of considering what it means to the next generation. What does it mean for a young woman to tell her friends, "Hey, my father was born in an internment camp, and this is not some little, flourish of my life. It's something that really continues to change the way I live every day." And one more few lines, if I could, uh, that again tells me what the kind of questions that went through Yiva's mind. Uh, she says here, now she's talking about how she's now an adult and she's about the age that her parents were when they moved to the US. And she says, I wonder if there will ever be a country that I can call home. Again, I want to remind you, this is a young girl who grew up in the US and she's saying, I don't know what country I can call home. And if that answer to that is yes, what would it mean to have a country that I can call home? A big a big part of it is being an overseas Chinese. Being Hakka, it's very common to migrate, to keep on moving. But the camp has really affected me in how I trust a government, trust a country, trusted people. I realized that it's something that's always set me apart from my siblings and some of my friends, is just how critical I can be about a system of governance and its leaders. So to me, this just opens up all the questions that Eva has to grapple with and has been grappling with all her life. What is she now, Joy? She's about 27 or so. I don't. Uh,
Yeah, about that. Yeah.
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 So for a quarter century, this young woman has been grappling with these questions, and I don't think she's been able to answer them yet. That to me, it really kind of makes this whole story so much deeper and more significant and more meaningful. And that's what I wanted to tell you when you asked me about the most memorable thing in the story.
Right. Yeah, Yiva's, thank you. Yiva is certainly a very, very special person. But she's also very, very articulate about how isolating the whole experience is, whether uh, you were there, whether you were born there, or whether you're um, a child of somebody who was born there, because that kind of, those sentiments, those feelings that you have of uh, being one, just you don't want any trouble, right? Nobody really wants trouble in their lives, and
Yeah.
so the whole situation of having been put in that terrible environment um, really makes you question who do you trust? Do you trust your government? Do you trust the governments of the places you live in? You contribute, you work, and you pay your taxes, but does that protect you? And that's really a very sad thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, she continues to grapple with it a lot,
Yeah.
as you've said.
I do want to mention that Eva is one of the first people who started collecting stories of people in the camp and putting them up online. And she had this blog, right? In
Hmm.
what is it?
Hmm.
indiadeoli.wordpress.com or something like that, where she had maybe a dozen stories, if I remember right, something like
Oh,
that.
it was about three.
Oh, it's
By the
about
time
three.
I saw it, it was about three. Yeah,
All right.
and it took her a long time
Yeah.
to write them because it's very difficult to talk about it.
Yeah.
So a lot of people ask me, do you want to? Well, what do people say? What was it like? We're getting questions which we'll answer in a little bit. Um, and so when you read the book, you'll see that a lot of similarities are there. Because there was nothing to do in the camp and it was
Yeah.
really boring. And so Eva's experience was when she would ask somebody, what was it like, grandma, what was it like in the camp? And she'd say, oh, there was nothing. Or people would say, oh, it's in the past, let's not talk about it. Because like I continue wanting people to tell their stories, but it's a sad story. It's a place they don't want to go back to, and it doesn't bring good memories back. So whoever wants to talk about it has already done their part, and I hope more people will do it. But it is really tough, just so that people get a sense of um, how horrible that experience was.
Uh,
So
may I just intervene? Uh, a couple of people have sent a message to me that they would want to understand the greater context of why this happened, what happened, how was the camp like, and some more history. So I thought it was right at this time, instead of at the question and answer session, to ask you to elaborate.
Okay,
Okay.
you want to take the history?
All right, I'll try that. So a lot of people who are watching here will know, of course, that we fought a war with China in 1962, India and China. That's our uh, continuing tensions on the border, which led to this war in 1962. It was a month-long war. It had been preceded by several years of tensions along the border because there's a long history there, but basically, as we know even today, the border between India and China has never been actually formally demarcated, whatever the correct word is. It's never been actually drawn out on the ground, and so therefore both sides have different perceptions of where the border lies, and so because of that. There were, we accused the Chinese of transgressing the border, and they accused us of crossing over, and Nehru had this forward policy and so on. So all that's the context in which this war came about eventually. That finally, I think China decided to, I think Mao decided that he's going to teach Nehru and India a lesson. So they came in, they pushed our forces, by and large, in most of the places, pushed our forces back, and inflicted this crushing defeat on us, and then retreated went back to their original lines, and that's where things have stayed more or less since then. At least we haven't had an all-out war for these 60 years. So that's the history that all of us in India know, we grew up with, and I think we it's taught to us to some degree or the other in school. What's not taught to us is this whole episode we're talking about. That because of this war, in 1962 we started rounding up people of Chinese descent, what we call them Chinese Indians, and sending them 3,000 of them to this camp in Rajasthan. Uh, there were a series of laws that the Indian government passed, called the Foreigners Act and the uh, Foreigners Restricted Areas Act, and there are about four or five. They were passed over a period of 4 or 5 months in 1962 and 1963, which gave the Indian authorities the legal basis to do this imprisonment of the 3,000 Chinese, because they wanted I mean, I like to call it just a legal fig leaf, but they wanted a way to say that we have to do this to protect the country's interests. And so 3,000 of them were sent to this camp in Rajasthan, ostensibly because there's a fear that some of them might be spies. But as far as I know, in all the people I've talked to, everything I've read, there was not a single actual spy who was found. Maybe Joy can corroborate that. And that's it. So they were sent to this camp, and many of them were kept there for a number of years. In Joy's case, her family was one of the last to be released. They were there for a total of 4 years, and they were released about 5 years after the war was over. So that's a brief capsule history of what happened. Joy, is there anything that you want to add to that?
No, you've covered it really well. As for the question of the spies, I think no, nobody was proven to be a spy, and there was no due process. There was nobody, doing anything. They were just thrown and forgotten about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, forgotten is a good word, because why exactly were you there in 1967? What was the reason to keep you there? What is the reason to keep anybody there once you've decided that they're not spies? I'm not even sure if there was any process done to interrogate any of you and to find out if you were spies. But what was the reason to keep you there for 5 years? I don't get it.
Well, let me bring up the incident about Home Minister Shastri. He went to the camp, and this was so China sent some ships to take people back to China, because if they were being in a detention camp, they were giving them a way out. So 2 batches of ships had come, and before the 3rd batch came, uh, Lal Bahadur Shastri, who was then the home minister, went to the camp, and he came to look at, check out the internees, and he actually went through an exercise, and he said, those who want to go to China, you stand on this side of the line. Here's the line. Those who want to stay back in India, you stand on this side. And so my father wanted to go back and work. You live where you work, and he had things he had to do and money he had to collect from his projects, and he wanted to always stay back in India. And so he stood on the India side, and everybody sorted themselves out. And then the home minister left, and nothing happened. And so, yes, we don't know. We were told at that time that if you want to stay back in India, you can go back to your home when the time, that's why he asked them to stand on one side. And I'll continue the other part of the story a little bit later.
The other part of Shastri, or can I?
The other part of the whole stay back in India story.
Okay. No, but I want to add a little bit about when Shastri went back to Delhi.
Oh yes, please do. Yeah.
And he went to Parliament, and he was asked by some of the MPs, because they knew he had just been to this camp. And this is a record. It's in the Rajya Sabha or the Lok Sabha records, and you can find them online. So somebody asks him, so what are the conditions like there? Is everybody are they did they refuse to go to China because China is a horrible country? And he says, yeah, I don't know, but what I can tell you is that they are exceedingly happy to be in that camp. And all of us also grew up having a lot of respect in this country for Shastri he might have been a very good prime minister if he had not died so early, and on and on. But to think that this man was actually went to Parliament and said this was something that I found stunning. And Joy, would you agree that you were all exceedingly happy in the camp?
Oh my goodness, I would say not. I do want to at this point bring up a couple of things about who these people were who were locked up. I see a lot of questions, and I'm not going to answer all of them, but this one is important. So who are the people who were taken? Why were the Chinese even in India? So when the British broke the monopoly of tea from China and moved tea production to India, they brought along a lot of people to help them build those tea plantations and seed the future tea gardens. And so a lot of Chinese came because they had experience in tea, and a lot of people followed them, as in, when one group goes in, they usually bring other people who will build factories. So you're talking about a lot of families who'd been there for 2 or 3 generations. So these were people who ate Indian food. They spoke in Hindi. They spoke whatever language, Nepali, Orang. Pardon?
Assamese.
Sorry? Assamese, yeah. Lots of people in Assam. They married local women, and they had children who, if you were to go by skin color, the children did not look Chinese at all, but they spoke Chinese. And so you're talking about a very complicated and very diverse kind of mix of who these people are. A lot of these people were stateless. A lot of people were not granted citizenship because I think the law hadn't been passed at that time, or I don't really know. Or like the people who were born before 1947, they had to. The government, Indian government, told them they had to get UK citizenship, and then. But a lot of these people were born in the homes, and so they didn't have the birth papers or certificates or the wherewithal to do it. And so a significant amount of the people who were put in the camps had Chinese passports because they were asked, it was suggested that, it's probably better that you're not stateless, which is true, right? And so, but unfortunately in this case, they were picked up, but not all Chinese citizens were picked up. So it was really very, there was no planning when the internment began. The people in Deoli were not prepared. They didn't even know these people could speak Hindi. So there was a big, a real mass confusion when thousands of these Chinese went and landed in Deoli, and they're registering them. And the officials feel they just think that these are people from China. God, I don't even know how to communicate with them. And then these people started speaking Hindi, and then there was all this communication about, we've lived here, and so it was a big learning curve for the officials. They didn't have enough beds, they didn't have any utensils, they didn't have clothing. It was just done without any planning. It was done overnight. People were picked up. We don't know who, what was the criteria. So that's some of the background.
Um, all right. I see we have some more questions, but let's just do a couple more things before we get to them. Joy, I've always wanted to know, just to go back to what we were talking about, Yiva and the influence on the next generation. When you got married and you had children, what did they think? What did your husband and your two sons start think about you and your experience in Deoli and this whole imprisonment? And is there any light you can shed on their reaction shed on your experience?
Yeah. So I did ask them, after we chatted a little bit. And so for my husband, Bill, mom is his mother-in-law, right? And so he sees her in a certain light. She's very poised and very gentle. She has a lot of grace and dignity. And so I told Bill that we were in the camp, and so mom would sometimes share stories, but it wasn't really till the book where so when we share stories, we don't share the saddest stories. When my mom tells me stories, it's kind of funny, because that's the only way you can deal with it, right? So they share the funny, the memorable stuff, not the most happy stuff. But and so it wasn't until the book where Bill truly understood my mother's strength and what she had to go through, right? And how resilient she is, and how it hasn't crushed her spirit. And so that's what he felt. And for my son, when he read my article that I wrote in 2012, that was the first one of the chapters in the book, he really actually felt much worse for my mother again, because she was one who experienced it. She was one who suffered it. But then when my mother actually sat down and talked to him one day, he felt terrible for me, because my mother said, when I came out to Calcutta, I was so scared. I'd never seen anything but the camp, and I wanted to go home. And so here was a little kid saying she wanted to go home, and home was this prison. So it really hit home, to him, how terrible the experience was. And when he read the book, he started talking to my mother more, and trying to dig deeper, just to connect with her and understand more. But again, she helped raise him, and she's told him sweet little stories, and he understands why she's such a storyteller.
Okay. Yeah, that's something that I always wondered about. I mean, I've met your husband and we talked about this, but I always I want to sit down one day with him, because I know he's of Chinese descent too, but he grew up in Hong Kong. Is that
Hong
right?
Kong, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So how does somebody like that view what happened to people like you? So I was just intrigued by that. Yeah, but
Okay,
anyway.
so I do have a couple questions, and then we can go into audience questions. So why do you think, well, I don't know, maybe it's my question for me, but you can take a pass. Why do you think there's such amnesia about the event? You did write a little bit about it.
Yeah, I think there are a few reasons. One is that it's a war that we lost, and we don't really like to remember. There's a certain amount of shame. We use that word stigma earlier. Maybe it applies to us also, that India lost this war. So we don't like to remember too much about the war. But also, I think there's some more. I think some of us who, when we do find out that this thing happened, and I think this may have applied back in 1962. We do find out that this imprisonment happened. I think a lot of us do feel that there is a definite injustice that happened, and so we want to forget about that too, because we don't. None of us, which country really likes to look back at its wrongdoings and face up to them, even though I think there is a need to face up to them. And then also, it has been 60 years. Generations come and generations go, and there are not so many people left, sadly enough, of Chinese descent in India. And those who were in the camp are getting older. I mean, it has been 60 years. So for all those reasons. And plus, of course, there are only 3,000 of you who were in the camp, and the whole community itself. I don't know, worldwide, what are we talking about? A few tens of thousands, maybe. So that's a really small community. And somebody's asked about the parallel to Japanese Americans, and we should talk about why that's. But so I think these are the reasons why there is this amnesia, and it's sad, but that's the way it is. Yeah.
And thank you. And so the last question I had for you was, what are the parallels currently to the internment?
Well, you mean in current day India, you mean? Is that what you're asking? Yeah. Well, again, there is now, it's gone off our front pages, but in December and early this year, we had this whole long-running debate about the Citizenship Amendment Act in the National Register of Citizens, CAA, NRC. There are a lot of parallels which some of my Chinese Indian friends have told me about, because it raises the same questions that were asked at that time, or that were relevant at that time. You know, who is an Indian? Who is a foreigner? Who is Chinese? What does that mean? Do you judge people only based on the way they look, or the particular religion they have, or what is it? What is it that defines us as Indians? I think these were questions that were important at that time in 1962, and they suddenly became important again, and they're being made important in 2020. And then, of course, Corona happened, and then again there was all this prejudice against the Chinese people who look Chinese, people from our northeast who were being called Corona. There were the stories of people who were stopped in the streets and people spat at them or shouted at them or assaulted them. And then there were cases, I think in Bangalore, there was a couple of cases where landlords came and kicked out of their flats some young women who were from Manipur or somewhere just because of the way they looked, saying, we don't want Corona people here. So that was one more parallel. And then finally, we had this, again, a border standoff with China, which seems to happen every now and then. And in this case, of course, 20 Indian soldiers lost their lives. But again, there was all this feeling against China and all these calls. There was a minister of our central government who said, we need to start boycotting Chinese food. And this was exactly what had happened in 1962. There were Chinese restaurants were being vandalized, and people were saying boycott all things Chinese and so on. So, there are all these reminders of what happened then. And I wish we could learn from what happened then and be a little wiser and a little more compassionate, a little more sensitive, a little stronger as a nation now. But unfortunately, I don't think that that lesson is being learned. And maybe that's because of the amnesia. So, yeah, I mean, it's, as we've discussed before, Joy, it's in some ways fortunate for this book that it came out at this time, because it has all these relevancies today. But it's so sad that there are these relevance. So I don't know whether to feel good about that or bad, because that's the way it is.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. And I just want to remind people that we're talking about civilians here. We're talking about civilians who were innocent, who did nothing, and this is what happened to them. And it was a terrible, dehumanizing experience, and it should be owned up to.
It should be owned up to. I mean, we should have the grace, the dignity, and the strength as a country to own up to it. I really feel that. Yeah. But should we go, Ajay? Is it time to start asking?
Yeah, yes, Dilip.
Thank you, Dilip. Thank you, Joy. I mean, between the both of you and Marshal Joy, have captured the tragedy of that event so many years ago. And instead of being an historical event, I suddenly find, like Dilip rightly said, a relevance to it now. And it sometimes makes me wonder why we don't learn from history and how we have changed, what changed in the last 60 years.
Yeah.
I'm on a personal note, I must say, on a totally different context. We ourselves are a small community who have come from the south of India to a little north of India. I mean, it was from Tanjavur to Nellore, and we were Tamilians. We still speak Tamil at home. But what I can connect is that we were not ostracized. We were not in prisons. We were not an intern. And society accepted us. and we still speak what we think is Tamil. The Tamilians will never agree with that. Uh, the and I can see that in the last 400 years since we have migrated to some 600 miles north, and there must be hundreds of such communities all over the country, and they were all accepted, and they were all mainstreamed so easily. But somehow these 3,000 Chinese, I do not. It's a shocking story of what happened. There are a torrent of questions, and some of them. I mean, in the beginning, we were wondering whether we would have enough questions, frankly. But it also is such a moving story, and I think that we have many questions. I myself have a question. I mean, it's a very small factoid which I want. When did you get a passport? You got an Indian passport? Your parents got an Indian passport? At what point in time did that happen? When you
I presume you're asking Joy and not me.
Me. Yeah. So sorry, I keep forgetting. It's the 1951 law, right, that granted that everyone who was born after 1947 would be granted Indian citizenship. So by rights of being born in Deoli, I got Indian citizenship. My parents were born before 1947, so they never got either Indian citizenship nor the UK citizenship. So they had to take on the Chinese passport, and my mom still has a Chinese passport.
Now we come to what, I mean, it's a very deep question. I think both of you can answer it. What makes governments do what they did to these Chinese Indians?
Joy, you want to take us?
I said,
I have no idea. I mean,
what they did to these Chinese Indians.
I don't know why governments do that.
It's important to understand this because you see a continuing effort by the state to other a part of the population to try to become, to discriminate and to go to any extreme and put them into a similar situation as what the Chinese Indian went into. It may not be prison camps, but then it's almost as good as that. So what makes the state do it?
I think, Ajay, there's one reason is that when that war broke out, let's just take our example. When that war broke out, there's a need for governments, politicians feel the need to show that they're reacting to this threat from abroad. And, the war is happening on our border. Yes, there's news coming from there every day, but maybe there's also public sentiment building up, and the government wants to react to that. The governments want to show that they're taking action of some kind. And here's a very visible way of showing that action. In the US, they did that to 100,000 Japanese Americans, and in India found it advisable in some sense to do it to 3,000 Chinese Indians. You take these people, you put them into a train, and you ship them across the country for 7 days, and you make a show of we are acting against the Chinese spies in our midst, and this is part of our furthering the national interest. I think it's an argument that sells very well in times of war, and I think that's unfortunately these 3,000 people paid the price for it. But I think that's what motivates governments to do this, and I don't think it's the last time. I think it's going to happen every time. Anytime there's another war, and there's a easy way to do something like this.
How many of these 3,000 Chinese went back to China actually?
Well, let me, before Joy answer that, she knows that I have an objection to this word back, because these were not people who were from China, so they were not going back to China. So really, we should be careful about using that word.
Yeah.
Okay, they were given the option of going to China because China sent these boats, and some of them took that option. But go ahead, Joy.
Right. So, for instance, my mother and my father were born in India, and like I said, my dad at one point he said his first language was Orang, and we were like, what? And so we thought it would be Chinese. So it's not that. So that just tells me that he was playing with all these kids and so on. So so how many went back? A majority of the 3,000 went to China with three batches. So there were like 4 ships out of Madras. And so the rest of them, I would say maybe less than 1,000, slowly got released over the years. And as the camp got smaller and smaller, they started moving them around to different areas where they were. So at one time, the camp was very packed, and then later on, the camp was much emptier.
Dilip, you mentioned about the Japanese Americans. There were 2 questions that our audience have asked on the Japanese Americans that were, what were the similarities you see? How were their experiences different? And what lessons are there to draw?
Well, the similarities are striking. The Japanese Americans looked different, just like Chinese Indians looked different from us. They were belonged to the U.S. but were ethnically from that enemy country at the time, because Japan attacked the U.S. in Pearl Harbor in 1941, and the U.S. was ostensibly taken by surprise by this attack, and therefore was floundering for a way to react, and this was one way they found to react. I mean, apart from conducting the war in the Pacific, they found a way to show that they were taking action against Japan by rounding up. And here's the one big difference, that they rounded up 100,000, 120,000 Japanese Americans, and they put them into various different camps. I think there may have been a dozen or more across the American West, and going into Oklahoma and to Wyoming and so on. A few hundred here, a few thousand there, on and on. But so there were many more Japanese Americans, and therefore I've had this reaction a few times. People say, "Oh, that was much worse because they imprisoned 100,000 and we only imprisoned 3,000." And I want to ask, is the number the how we decide what's worse or not? I mean, or is it just what happened? And so really the parallels are so striking that we imprisoned people just like the Americans did. And the other difference is that most of these Japanese Americans were released in 1945, early 1945, before the war actually ended. Whereas we kept, as we know, as Joy has told us already, we kept up. First of all, they went to the camp after the war was ended, but we kept them for a good 5 years after the war was finished in that camp. So that's another difference. But I certainly believe that we did this based on the US's, the American playbook, if you want to call it that, with the Japanese.
Question to Joy here. What language did you and your parents speak at home? Would you think that there was something specific about being Chinese in terms of culture and habits in the family?
Oh yeah, I think my family is very Chinese, but we have deep Indian roots, and we have like this general Western culture that is shared. So when I was growing up, in the beginning in Deoli, I would have spoken just Cantonese, and then when I went to Calcutta, I spoke Bengali and Mandarin, and then I spoke. So because we were in Calcutta, we speak Bengali, we don't speak Hindi, and so didn't study Hindi until I went to school. And after I went to school, we started speaking English at home, mostly, with a smattering of Cantonese and Nepali, because my mother grew up in Kalimpong, and they have a very strong Nepali culture out there. And so in a single language, in a single sentence, my mother would use 3 different languages, like in English, Chinese, Nepali, a little bit of Hindi, where necessary. So, culturally, groups are very separate in India, as you know. So clearly, we at home we speak Chinese, or later on Hindi. English, and so with your friends, you speak English and Bengali.
Can I just add again a story that Joy knows that I like a lot is when I was traveling with some of these Chinese Indians in a bus in Canada a couple of years ago, and one of them, there's a whole story there which I'll tell you later, but one of them they said, why don't you sing a song? And so presumably he was known for his singing, and his story is in the book actually, Ying Sheng Wong. He started singing the song. This is a man who's been away from India for 50, 55 years, whatever it is. he started singing the song, an old Bollywood song, Ajib Dastan Hai Ye, which I'm sure all of our listeners will know. And his most comfortable language. He was speaking to me and speaking to others in Hindi. He appears in Rafiq Elias's film speaking Hindi. So that's the effect. That's the long time bond that people feel to India. Anyway, carry on.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Just wanted to add, like, a lot of the people, the Indian Chinese still in India, they are very assimilated. You know, they all speak Hindi, they all eat Indian food, and they're really immersed in the culture. So the longer, especially in the over the last 20, 30 years, that assimilation is very deep.
No, but Dilip, to just clarify, Bollywood is a great global product we have. And even if he's not from China or India or in Europe or anywhere, it would have unified him.
I'll take your word for that. Can I just add one more small thing about the Japanese Americans, which I forgot to say, is that a lot of those people who were turned, their sons were actually fighting for the US in Germany and some cases in Japan. So that's the irony of that Japanese American situation.
Okay.
While we are on the Japanese Americans.
Yes, I wanted to add a couple more things on Japanese Americans. Sorry, Ajay, before I forget.
Go ahead.
So I think some of the Japanese Americans were also stateless because they didn't have, at that time, they weren't allowed to be citizens. So it was easy. So they were already born here, right? Born in the US, but they, like a lot of the people in India, they couldn't get their citizenship because they weren't allowed. There was no law allowing it. So that was one thing. The one thing that was very different from the Japanese internment and the internment of the Chinese in Deoli is, for the Japanese, they had, yes, it was imprisonment, but they had schools, they had activities, they had a lot of, at least the optics seem a lot better, that they had a lot of other things to do, extracurricular, but there was nothing in Deoli. There was an occasional movie screening, perhaps tennis for a lucky few, but that was it. And you were all on your own. There was no schools. So all the kids who went to Deoli just lost years of their lives. Some never recovered. Some did manage to go back to school, and a lot of them didn't graduate school or go to college. So those were truly lives interrupted.
Sorry, Ajay, you go.
Yeah. Ravi is recommending that we watch Snow Falling on the Cedars, which is set in the backdrop of Japanese American flight in the USA. It's a film that he is recommending. Snow Falling on the Cedars.
Yeah, it's a book by a guy called David Gutterson. It's set on in Bainbridge Island in Washington, and was made into a wonderful film also. It's a love story set in that Japanese internment.
Yeah, and he's saying also that there is a Chinese-Indian singer in India right now. His name is Mayang Chang. He has even acted in small roles in Indian films. So,
yeah, we are aware of that.
Tell them about him.
Oh, Mayang recently which one? We've been in touch with him. Yeah, we've been in touch with him. So for me, if I close my eyes, I don't know Mayang is Chinese. He sounds completely Indian to me. So this is the level of assimilation we're talking about. And these are people who ripped out, and thrown into Deoli. We hope we might have a conversation with him. And he wrote, was it a video?
Yeah, he did a video a few weeks ago.
He did a video. Yeah, great video. I encourage you all to watch it. It talks about what it means to be different and why.
In this time of Corona and of this Chinese, the border tensions, yes.
I forget, was it done? Yeah, good one. I encourage everybody to watch it. Yeah.
There are two questions, both related to each other. One is, we had, I would say, a significant Chinese community in India. Apart from these 3,000 people, there were Chinese doctors, Chinese dentists, now we have a few Chinese restaurants run by Chinese, but they're slowly coming down in number. Maybe in Calcutta they have. So the first question is, how did they see you? Because you were in these intern camps, and was there a problem there between the communities? First question. And second, what happened to these small, many Chinese communities in various cities and towns which have slowly vanished?
I'll take a pass at it. I believe from historical stuff that I've seen that right before the war, a lot of people actually immigrated to the UK. They were looking for skilled labor, and a significant amount of professional people left. So the doctors, the lawyers, so all those, the office workers, they left. And so the people who were left behind were the business people. And so most of the people, in fact, all of the people, like my father's family had a business. Michael's father ran a restaurant, and so did the others. So for a lot of the people who came out of the camp, they left. It was not an environment they wanted to live in, especially younger folk. A lot of them immigrated to Canada, Toronto. Others immigrated to Vancouver, and I think over the years there has been a lot of immigration, and but there is still a significant community of Hakka people in Calcutta. I think they're still doing the leather trade, and then different community things, the restaurants, the dry cleaning. So I don't have that much information, but this is what I know.
Yeah, there's a Chinatown in Calcutta. The whole Tangra area is also known as a Hakka settlement. A lot of Hakka people still there, Chinese restaurants and so on. Some of those other towns in Tinsukia and Macomb and all have a few Chinese people here and there. And what I always found interesting, and you can find this on Google Maps too, is that the area in Tinsukia and in Macomb, these are little towns in Assam, where there used to be Chinese, was known as Chinapatti. Meaning a Chinese neighborhood. And you look up Google Maps now, you will find that Chinapatti still there, which is so that's even now.
Okay, Abbas Jafri is asking whether there is any way to seek compensation and an apology from the Indian state for this internment. Was it ever attempted? It could act as a deterrent for any future brashness by the state, is this?
Well,
or were there, or I combined another question is, were there also any suits that were filed in courts of law?
So Joy, you want to go first?
Okay, I'll go first. So in 2012, the All India Deoli Chinese Association, AIDCI, I think, they sent a letter to then Prime Minister Manmohan Gandhi. Manmohan Singh, sorry, apologies. And so they sent a letter asking for an apology. Never heard back. And then the next attempt was taking a letter to the consulate in 2017 to Ottawa, the Indian consulate in Ottawa, and Dilip joined that trip. They didn't accept the letter, but they finally taped the letter to the gate. Besides that, there was some talk about looking into some legal suit, but I think that's so much in the past. I don't think anything could be affected. And then finally, no, that's about it.
The parallel, though, I mean, is the Japanese Americans again, because the Japanese Americans did, over many years, lobby for and eventually in 1988 got an apology from President Reagan, a formal apology and reparations to the tune of $20,000 per person who was, or per family, I'm not sure, that was interned. So, I mean, the reason I think they got it is because, yes, there were a lot more people. Fewer years had passed. In 1988, it was only 40 years. And also, there were Japanese Americans in different elected positions in the US Senate and Congress and all, who could make a case for this. And unfortunately, we don't have people like that in India to make this case loudly. And there are only 3,000 people. So,
did you have any reaction from the government or any other authority on this book, saying that it is out of whatever reaction. Is there any official response to this kind of book written?
Well, I would love love for there to be a reaction of any kind from the government, but as far as I know, there's been none. Joy, have you heard of any reaction? I don't think our
No,
publishers have
not
told
me.
us about any reaction.
No.
There's a very good comment here. Not a question, but a comment on myself. I used to ridicule people who didn't know about our country's history. We'll never do it again after seeing my own ignorance of a concentration camp in our own country 15 years after independence, that too. My being a child at that time is no excuse. Thank you for remedying that problem. At least we now, a large section of us who did not know, I think, know about this horrible story which we have started.
That was our aim with the book, really, to get people to just to put the story out so people know.
Right. So that I would say is my main goal: awareness and education before, and hopefully that would someday lead to an acknowledgement. And who knows, in distant future.
Joy, you keep saying this, right? You'd like to be able to go into a room full of Indian people and have more than nobody say that we knew that this happened, right?
Right. And hopefully not only Indian people, and any other people is fine too. But yeah, I just feel the more aware you are of who you are or what has happened, the better humans we all are. And, it's really to me, there were small acts of kindness along the way, little ones, but those were important. There were others that were not so great. And so we try to put that in perspective.
Okay.
One more. Salil has a question, Ajay.
Yes, go ahead.
Since we are talking identities, I'm very curious to know the identity that Chinese Indians have taken on after migrating to US or Canada. Are they Chinese American or Indian American?
Okay, I can talk more about. There's barely anybody here except me, the United States. Let's see. Let me talk about the Canadians. So the Canadian people in Toronto, they have a significant amount, and whenever they get together, they eat Indian food, they sing Indian songs, and they speak in Hindi. So just to show you how deep the roots go, I don't think they've ever quite left, but they also have their own identities. They also speak Hakka, and they have to work in the Canadian world. So it's like that tri-cultural aspect I spoke of earlier. You're part Chinese, you're part Indian, and then you are like this wherever you have to work. You have a different, not identity, but you are yourself. That is your truth, and that's who you are. And so that's what I keep saying, that it's really difficult to peel back. I always say I was born in India. I'm Indian. Because that's a deep part of me. But I'm probably not speaking Hindi as much. I speak more English right now. But I don't think they ever leave. Like my dad, he was diabetic. He was not diabetic, but he would love to eat, jalebis and stuff like that. Yeah, so we are all a meld of our identities.
Correct. So true.
Dilip and Joy, I think there are some more questions, but we'll close this. I want to say to everyone who's listening that Dilip writes fabulously in several places, and his weekly column in Mint is a joy to read. So do follow Dilip and read him. I also extracted a promise from him that he'll play harmonica, on which he is so good, before we end this session. Dilip, do you mind doing that?
I can hardly say I mind, but I would love to do that. So I just thought I'd play. I'm going to try this. I haven't practiced the song for a while, but since I mentioned it a little while ago. And
yes, I was about to say, could you do that?
Yeah, and since this is such a Ajib Dastan, such a strange story, I would like to just try and play that song. So excuse me if I make any mistakes, but here we go. Okay, thank
That
you.
was wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Dilip.
All right.
Thank you, Dilip. Thank you, Joy.
Thank you,
And ladies and gentlemen, just want to tell you that next Saturday on 8th evening, we have Dr. Viral Acharya and Dr. Rakesh Mohan in a conversation at Manthan. We are doing it in the evening because both of them are in the United States, and we'll have that conversation. Look forward to that. It's going to be very exciting. And we have events planned after that as well. So keep tuned. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dilip and Joy, once again.
thank you.
Thank you, Ajay. Thanks, Vikram.
Thank
And
you.
Dilip,
Rest of the team.
we won't wait for another 10 years to invite you again.
Okay. But thanks a lot. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.